Thought we'd do another camera video. This time I'm going to look at something a bit older, the Konica Minolta Dynax 5D. This is also known as the Maxxum or Alpha. Some of these specifications are on screen for you just to give an idea on what we're looking at here. Things have changed quite a lot over the years, but this was using the 6.1 megapixel CCD. Start off with a quick body tour just to have a look at some of the design elements. On the left hand side, you'll notice we do have a dial there which is dedicated to the white balance. Hot shoe with this is the Minolta inverted style one. Not everyone was a fan of that hot shoe, but I didn't really have a problem. You could just get an adapter for it. On the right hand side, there's the main program or mode dial. Both of these dials are pretty stiff. They do not move easily. I never had a problem with them knocking out of position. Next to that we have the drive button and the ISO. Compared to the more expensive 7D, this is the second and last model that Konica Minolta made. This has less controls, but it did offer the same sensor at a more affordable price. They're using a penta mirror on this. There's another difference between this and the 7D, which had a penta prism. Always liked the grip on this camera, very comfortable camera to hold. Most cameras with a compact flash card would go in the other way around. This one is the label facing away from you. This takes the Type 1 and the Type 2 cards. Onto the flash now, we'll have a look at that. It's a manual lift on this. It doesn't come up automatically, and I like that. You do have wireless flash control as well with the built-in flash for off-camera flash. Moving on to the back of the camera, we've got the on-off switch. I never had a problem with it myself. It didn't bother me at all. Some people complained about that. Most of the markings are engraved on the buttons. They're not just painted on the surface, which is another unusual touch. And the body material overall feels quite solid. It definitely feels better than many of the other manufacturers' offerings at this time. You do have options on this display to make the settings larger, but it is pretty rough really by modern standards in terms of the resolution. Couple of neat features though. It does have the sensor there, so it switches off when you've got it to your eye, and it also rotates around when you're turning the camera into the vertical position in both directions, and I like that. That was a nice touch. Just on the underside now, we've got the standard tripod socket, and we'll open up the battery compartment. These cameras are getting on a bit now, so what you're going to have to do probably is try and find some third-party batteries, and there are still some out there. I got one of these from Duracell Direct. It's a much better quality battery, third-party cell. When I move in closer showing you the menus, you can actually see the dots on the screen quite clearly. As I said, it does get the job done, but it's not a particularly nice screen to use. On the upside, the menu system is pretty straightforward. It is tabbed, and it's fairly easy to navigate through that. Not too many options in there. When you move into the function menu, that brings you up into your focus area, autofocus mode, metering, your flash exposure compensation, and you can also pick the picture style that you want. Despite the fact Minolta cut down the controls on this model, it is still pretty intuitive, and you don't really end up menu diving very often. That's about the only menu that you're going to go into is the function one on a regular basis. As you can hear, it's not the quietest shutter out there. A friend of mine calls it the Pac-Man shutter. Viewfinder's perfectly fine in terms of the size and the clarity, but it doesn't have a full-time display for the ISO. It does show up when you press the button, but it is a bit annoying. On the right hand side you do have that anti-shake scale as well, which was a useful feature. Never felt that the focus on this camera was as fast as the film cameras for some reason. If you're in low light, you're probably better off using that center focus point. Let's have a look at the image quality now. Certainly I've never had any complaints with this. Despite being an older sensor, it's pretty good. These shots are raw now, so there is a bit of noise in the raw files, and you'll see some color noise at 3200. It's pretty easy to clean it up, to be honest. I have no problems using the higher ISO, though there is a slight color shift at the very highest level. JPEGs are pretty good balance. There's a bit of color noise there. few hot pixels are showing up, but they do auto map out at the beginning of each month. In terms of the dynamic range, we're going back a few years now, so you have to be a bit more careful, particularly with the highlight clipping. You'll probably get about a stop back in RAW, and you can push the shadows up, possibly a couple of stops, but you're not going to be doing any of these dramatic sort of 5-stop shadow pulls that you can get away with on modern cameras. There is an interesting feature that they did implement, it's this zone matching, and that's quite useful in some situations. I'll give you an example of that in a minute, but you are fixed at either 80 for the shadows or the high at 200 ISO. When you go to the high 200s, you'll be able to see that it does still retain the highlights, but it does lift the image up, makes it a bit brighter. And when you go back to the low 80, that really lifts the shadows up at the expense of losing the highlight detail. Both of these are quite useful, but you have to use them for their own specific purpose. I'll just show you the raw files. I haven't touched these at all, but you'll be able to see the difference there. Even if you are shooting raw, that is quite a useful mode to have, particularly with the high 200. That will definitely drop down the exposure and it helps protect the highlights. So you could just use that for raw. Just make sure that you realize that your JPEGs are going to come out quite high key if you're using that mode. A lot of people complained with the 7D that it underexposed with the honeycomb or multi-segment metering. So they made it a bit brighter on the 5D. It is autofocus point based, so do bear that in mind. So when you move the focus point around, it does bias the exposure towards that. Most of the time that works quite well, but do remember if you're taking things like landscape shots that it will skew the exposure depending on where you put the focus point. You might find it a little bit bright some days where you might want to bring the exposure down maybe 2/3 of a stop. The performance isn't much different from most of the cameras out there at the time. Do remember that the reds can be pretty strong on this camera in the standard mode. Sometimes I use the portrait mode, and that's a little bit more restrained in terms of the color reproduction. Very nice skin tones though for a digital camera. I always felt this was a very appealing camera for portraits. And let's be honest, the look of an image is pretty important for photography, so if you find something that you like, then it is definitely worth sticking with it, even if it's old technology. All of these cameras do vary in terms of their look and appearance, and I've always had a soft spot for this camera, which is why I have two of them. I bought another one a few years ago, and I kept one as a spare. By far the most common problem on these cameras is the first black frame issue. What happens is you'll take a shot, the camera will display error message in the viewfinder. Usually it means that you have to turn the camera off and then on again. One of my cameras has it, the other one was sent back for repair, and I've never had a problem with it since. Some cameras can continue to function and some of them just stop working. So if you're going to buy one of these, make sure you know whether or not it has this problem or if it has been fixed. Minolta pioneered the in-body anti-shake stabilisation system, and this was the second DSLR to have it. It's true, newer systems do have better stabilisation, but you're probably going to get about 3 stops out of it, roughly. It's a very useful feature to have, and all of the lenses that you put on there will benefit from that, including the prime ones. There's another issue with a weak battery door latch, and what happens with that is there's an S-shaped plastic part, not a spring, and it just sort of breaks over time. It's one of the weaker points in the build quality. Otherwise, the plastic build on this is actually excellent. The other issue that you're going to find is the hard rubber on the port covers, so many of those will be missing and they crack. With some of them, I've just sort of glued them back into place because I don't really use them. There's a few lenses that are worth picking up for this camera, and they're quite affordable. Don't ignore the 18 to 70mm kit lens because that is actually quite a good lens. 27 to 105mm equivalent. Perfectly decent in terms of the optical performance. 100 to 200mm f4.5. I've done a review on this lens. Excellent little lens, very small, and a fairly fast aperture of 4.5. The 50mm 1.7 is also worth a look. Gives you a bit of depth of field control. Also handy to have for low light shooting. Unfortunately, A-mount didn't get the attention it really deserved going forward from Sony over the years. It was sort of a half-hearted effort from the company. I much prefer this camera to the A100. The look of the images is much more pleasing to my eyes. That wraps it up for me on this video. Thank you for watching. Comments and questions, do drop them down below, and I'll see you in the next one.